Futurized goes beneath the trends to track the underlying forces of disruption in tech, policy, business models, social dynamics, and the environment. I'm your host, Trond Arne Undheim, futurist and author. In episode 5 of the podcast, the topic is the future of decentralized finance. Our guest is Dan Elitzer, investor at IDEO CoLab Ventures. Dan, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Trond. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy you were coming on the show today. And I wanted to just acknowledge that it's been a while since we met back at Sloan, and you've done so many exciting things. I'm just going to list off some of them. You're currently an investor at IDEO, the CoLab Ventures. But I looked back in your background, and you've been working for some foundations and NGOs earlier.
Yeah.
Foundation.
Yeah, before I was at MIT Sloan for my MBA, I worked in the nonprofit sector. I worked at Grameen Foundation, which is an organization that supports microfinance and different financial and technological tools to empower people in developing countries. And then in the process of doing that is when I fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole.
The Bitcoin rabbit hole. I guess I've been down that hole a little bit as well. I remember it must be back in 2014 when my consulting firm at the time did a study on Bitcoin's impact on banks. And since then, a lot has happened to both Bitcoin and banks, I guess.
Yeah, it's been an interesting period. I'll say that for sure.
The last time we met, you were at the MIT Sloan FinTech conference and the student organization around FinTech. Tell us a little bit about that. How you kind of got into FinTech during your time at Sloan.
Sure. Well, I'd kind of had that FinTech interest coming in, as I mentioned, with my previous part of my career being focused on that intersection of finance and technology. And the FinTech club at MIT Sloan was something that I helped start with a number of classmates. And it was really just being inspired by how things were starting to change and the new capabilities that were coming to the forefront. And at the same time as I was starting that, I also started the MIT Bitcoin Club to really go deeper on Bitcoin and on what became a broader interest in cryptocurrencies, crypto assets, blockchain technology, and all the possibilities that whole sector entails. And I do think it dovetails very nicely with FinTech. And I've become increasingly convinced over the last 5 or 6 years that in the future, these two areas will become increasingly combined.
So we'll talk more about that. I just wanted to touch on this, that didn't all MIT students get some Bitcoin at some point? And what was it worth
Yes.
then, and what is it worth now?
Yeah. So at the time, Jeremy Rubin, who was an undergrad, and I teamed up to work on the MIT Bitcoin project. And we announced that in the spring of 2014. And then in the fall of 2014, we ran a study where we enabled every MIT undergrad to receive $100 worth of Bitcoin, which at the time, I think it was worth somewhere in the $300 to $400 range. So today I think it's floating around $9,000. So those students have done quite well who held on to it. But the goal at the time was really to understand more about what could happen in a world where you can assume that your peers all have access to Bitcoin as well. Because there's always this bootstrapping problem with new technologies. We thought, hey, this is a pretty tight-knit community. If a group of very smart young people who are largely technical all had access to Bitcoin, what would they do with it? What could they build with it or on top of it? And how would they use or not use it? And we saw some interesting results.
So I guess that one thing that has happened is that it's not just technical people that are interested in this anymore, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think some people with financial interests and kind of interests around monetary theory were some of the early adopters too. But it's grown well beyond that. And you've got a lot of people coming at it from both a technical perspective and a financial perspective. And I think in the industry, a lot of people tend to break it down almost East Coast, West Coast, in terms of New York kind of being the center of finance, and people on the East Coast coming at it from very much a financial innovation perspective. And then people on the West Coast coming at the space really from a kind of technology innovation perspective.
That's really interesting. I think that, obviously, in order to have immense impact, it has to cater as a technology to various communities. In the interest of, there's just such a concept soup in this area, could you just summarize a few of these terms as we're getting into decentralized finance? Let me just list off a few and you can add some more, but just for the benefit of our discussion even, there's the notion of cryptocurrency, which we were onto with Bitcoin. There's the blockchain protocol and what that all means. There's tokens, which is kind of an interesting concept, all the way up to kind of decentralized finance and a bunch of other things around that. Could you just unbundle some of those things real quick?
Sure. Let's start with Bitcoin because that's where it all began. And I think it's the simplest one to understand. When people talk about Bitcoin, they're talking about a protocol, the Bitcoin protocol. They're talking about a network of computers that are all running the Bitcoin protocol and are software and are communicating with each other. And then they're talking about Bitcoin, the asset, often using the symbol BTC. And so Bitcoin is often referred to as a cryptocurrency. I think in some ways it's a bit of a misnomer. When people think currency, they have a lot of preconceptions that come along with it that Bitcoin doesn't really fit into. And that often causes people to just dismiss it because they say this couldn't possibly be a currency. This couldn't possibly be money. But you've got that asset that runs on this network, right? It exists on the Bitcoin network, which is updating a blockchain, which is an immutable ledger that is shared among a network of computers. And it allows for what I like to think about it getting a little technical here is row by row permissions, right? Anybody can update the database to move their Bitcoin, right? To update the record of who owns a Bitcoin that they currently own, but nobody can update anybody else's record. You can only update your own. And that was a big breakthrough. And we've now seen that you can use blockchains and protocols like this to enable a whole host of applications and use cases beyond just tracking a single asset like Bitcoin. So when you say tokens usually refer to assets that are issued on a blockchain network, the Ethereum network being the most popular one at this stage for issuing tokens. And people then are building applications that use these tokens in various ways, and they can resemble money or currencies. They can resemble things that are closer to equities. They can resemble debt instruments. There are all sorts of different types of assets that you can create on these blockchains that are represented through tokens that can be transferred.
And real quick, isn't it also true that, some of these tokens in the beginning and in some sort of startups' minds, when they were creating this idea of tokens, they didn't initially represent anything external to the network, but they can in various ways be converted to cash. But that's not necessarily the point of these tokens, or am I wrong?
Right. I think there's a big range of things that they can represent. I think what we saw in 2017, when we had this boom in ICOs or initial coin offerings, what was largely being created was akin to gift cards. These people were issuing these tokens that were meant to be used for a very specific application, kind of like a specific business. And there wasn't really a lot of reason to do that from a kind of business or user perspective. It was largely about fundraising, and that makes it look a lot like a security. And so that was problematic in terms of how that was approached. What we've seen since then, right, after the hype died down and people started thinking more deeply, okay, we're past this initial hype. What are these tokens actually useful for? And one of the answers is, well, you can use these digitally scarce tokens to represent ownership over a protocol. And you can use that to govern that protocol and make changes to it, right? If you think about how traditionally open source software has been maintained and updated, It's kind of a very mushy process, right? Very soft. It'll happen in various discussion forums, on GitHub, on places like that. But ultimately, there is somebody who holds the right to update a code repository. There's somebody who can kind of make a final decision there. And if you want this to be truly decentralized, actually doing it through a provable fashion of like, we are essentially having a vote, and based on your weight and your ownership of these tokens, you can have more influence in terms of how a network or protocol or application is going to evolve going forward.
When you explain it that way, it seems pretty transparent. But I would say a lot of the discussion about how quickly this particular type of fintech instrument is going to kind of wash over the field of finance has to do with trust, doesn't it? So how much trust was sort of lost in this ICO situation where a couple of years ago, a bunch of startups, like you pointed out, were trying to raise money, some in dubious ways, others completely legitimately, but without really having the asset clarified or representing anything truly beyond the fact that it was a promise of something in the future. So as you pointed out, it was a fundraising instrument purely.
Yeah, and I think people tried to paint it as different things. It's not insignificant that most people's initial impression of this technology, of this industry, was about a lot of hype and around something that was clearly not sustainable. So I'll just say that up front. But I've got to say, having been focused entirely on this space for the last 6 or 7 years, the past few years have been wonderful for building because a lot of people who came to make a quick buck have gotten out, and those who are still here and still building are those who deeply appreciate the potential of this technology and of this space, and are building what I believe are the foundations for a real overhaul of our financial system, and in terms of creating one that is much more inclusive, much more accessible, and is able to innovate at a much, much, much faster pace than has ever previously been possible.
Well, and if that's true, that's truly exciting, right? For a sector, if you just talk about the financial sector, although I think as we will talk about this has ramifications way, way beyond finance as such. And that's, I think, one of the complexities, as that we will cover here. But if it truly enables various sectors to innovate faster, I guess that's one of the big things that we have all realized, in sort of this day and age, that this kind of innovation, could be really, really interesting to make use of. Let's now move more into sort of this recent development of decentralized finance and the paradigms that are starting to emerge here. You are very optimistic, as I read the timbre of your voice when you talk about decentralized finance. What is decentralized finance? Is it kind of the sum of the things that we have been talking about now, or is it something more in addition to that?
Largely it is. So the way I like to describe the kind of end goal of decentralized finance, or I actually prefer the more accessible term open finance, is that we are building tools that will make it possible for anyone, anywhere in the world, to be able to access or create any financial instrument that they can imagine. And that can be their own currency. That could be, issuing their own shares of some kind of venture organization. This could be creating new types of financial derivative products. Whatever you can think of, you can create these things and you can remix them. And there is no intermediary who can tell you yes or no. You just merely need to find somebody else who also wants to use this thing that you've created. And that's the kind of thing that we saw happen with kind of publishing with the internet, right? And kind of this whole, like, the Web 2.0 movement, which was largely about user created content. We are now entering a phase of kind of user created finance, where anybody in the world can take power over their ability to interact with money and value and their financial well-being in a way that's never previously been possible.
This brings to mind for me the fact that in fields that previously had some people controlling them, notably finance and politics and even media, and obviously all industries have a power structure. What does this do to the power structure when it increasingly becomes possible for players, like you said, anyone ostensibly to really shake up the system, or at least to act more as independent actors and not just be fully constrained really by either monopolies or just existing models and ways of doing things that are either inefficient or unfair in terms of access? What does it do though to the people that sit there with vested power? I mean, I was alluding to the 2004 14 study that we did on Bitcoin. One of the issues there, of course, was, banks. What are they going to do? Are they going to experiment with this? Are they going to ignore it? And if they embrace it, what does it mean to them? Would you say that there's a maturity now among kind of the powers that be, that this, even though it is disruptive, also can have value for those players? Or would you say that they have kind of concluded the opposite, that this is going to be a massive change, which when it sort of really shows up is going to really change everybody's playing field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that, starting around that 2014, 2015 era, I was actually very impressed at how some of the large banks and financial institutions were starting to take seriously what they've referred to as blockchain technology, right? And I don't think it's catching them unaware. I'm not sure that they all have a full understanding of the likely direction that things are headed. But I don't think this is going to disrupt banks and obsolete them. I think it will change their role and where some of their growth opportunities lay. But it's not going to, end the banks. It's just merely opening up a much, much broader playing field and letting other new entrants come in and move a lot faster. Right? We're moving from a world where it's a default no, right? You need to ask somebody's permission to access financial networks and financial protocols, to a default yes, where anybody can interact with these open networks, these open protocols, without having to ask anybody else's permission.
I mean, it's a very positive picture you paint here, Dan. It would be wonderful if that really is the direction it's going. Can we talk for a second about the finance numbers here? So, let's pick some markets that you're excited about. I know you were pointing out to me an actor. This is just one actor called Compound Finance. Maybe we can start with them, just to show what kinds of numbers and what sort of size impact this is starting to have on various smaller markets. So what are the numbers really in decentralized finance right now? How significant of a force is it?
Yeah, it's still very nascent. I'll say that first. So I think there's currently around $1.6 billion worth of various assets that are deposited into these various DeFi protocols. Compound Finance is currently the largest. It has around $600 million today in assets in it. And it's I would say, money market protocol. It's a protocol to allow anybody to permissionlessly loan or borrow certain assets. And these are all, to be clear, these are all crypto assets that exist on the Ethereum network.
Got it. And what are the growth rates, year on year in this market for people who care about that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's been an absolute hockey stick, even over just the past few months. Compound, a little over a month ago, I think was sitting on around $100 million in assets. And it's just, and it got there over the period of about a year or so. So that, even that was pretty incredible growth. But they just kicked off a new evolution to their model which has kicked them and a lot of others in the space into this kind of hyper growth moment where, harkening back to the thing we talked about earlier with tokens, they have started distributing a governance token over their protocol to users of the protocol. So they've set aside about 43% of their tokens to give out to users who borrow and lend through this protocol to eventually essentially hand over governance of the protocol entirely to users or whoever ends up holding those tokens. And I think that's incredibly exciting. It's created massive subsidies effectively because people are valuing these tokens and saying, this is adding to the effective interest rate I'm earning as a lender, or in some cases, such a heavy subsidy that it was even leading to negative rates on borrowing. But it's led to this astronomical level of growth, which I think does have some shades of that 2017 ICO boom we talked about in terms of some of the mania that it's setting off. But what we are also seeing is that it is in cases leading to sustained growth that exists even once the incentives are removed. For example, there was one particular market that had been heavily incentivized within Compound. It started with less than $1 million in borrowing, and even once the incentives had been largely taken away from it, it was now over $50 million in borrowing. And so these incentives are proving to be very effective to bootstrap networks and bootstrap liquidity. And I think it is ultimately going to lead to them being of the size where they can start being interesting to people outside this currently small industry and really create globally accessible markets for borrowing and lending. And the most popular assets are actually dollar denominated assets. These are often referred to as stable coins or crypto dollars. So there's the ability to get much higher yields from lending these crypto dollars via Compound than you can earn in your bank account. And it's accessible to anybody anywhere in the world, not just people with access to a US dollar denominated account within the traditional banking system.
This is fascinating, and it clearly, has impact on the financial services industry and on financial actors and on individuals' ability to kind of become truly financial actors on their own, which is very powerful. But there's also this idea that these protocols and the decentralization could affect many, many other industries. I know, the energy industry has been exploring this. A bunch of other industries have looked at it, like you said, publishing. It's interesting potentially for that purpose. Can you give us some examples of areas quite beyond finance where this is starting to at least to be experimented with and some results that are coming out of that?
Yeah, so we've actually done some experiments within IDEO CoLab dating back to, it was like 2016, where we were looking at the intersections of blockchains and IoT devices. And we built a prototype with NASDAQ and a large energy firm and a small startup back in 2016 that showed how you could actually connect a solar panel to a blockchain to issue renewable energy certificates and create an audit trail for that, and allow these kind of energy credits to be traded on a blockchain. So that's kind of one area that we've seen. There have been a lot of applications around applying blockchains to supply chains. There have been some very big initiatives there, which I think have a lot of potential in the future. But I think that in a lot of ways, what we need now is to focus on the more financial use cases, because I do think that those are kind of the first place where we're going to see a wedge for this technology. And once we have robust open financial infrastructure, it will be much easier to tie in some of these other applications that may not be directly financial in nature.
Got it. And I want to move into talking a little bit about IDEO, which is fascinating in a second. But Can you just give us a sense first on the timeline? So what we're talking about now. So I just asked about kind of the beyond finance use cases, and it's obviously since the use case is very nascent, even within finance. Of course, in other sectors, it's going to be even longer timelines. Give me your best guess on kind of when is decentralized finance the default, or at least a default option for finance? And secondly, when is it going to be in a significant way moving into, let's say, a pack of other industries?
Yeah, I think we have probably another decade to go at least before we see decentralized finance moving the traditional financial world in a way that everybody is paying attention to. I think it's similar to the evolution of how we think about the internet, right? In terms of we used to have internet companies and internet startups, and today it would almost it sounds silly to say, "Oh, I'm starting an internet company," right? And I think that's going to be the same thing with a lot of these decentralized finance tools. That eventually it's going to be silly to say I'm starting a DeFi company or DeFi project. It's just going to be part of the tool set that you must use to be competitive doing anything that touches financial services.
That's exciting. And let's move into talking about startups in a second. But first, IDEO, it's such a storied place, and it's kind of the home. I think of it as the home of design thinking, and fascinating place. How is it to work there? What have you learned? What have you discovered that's stimulated you in a different way than other places you worked?
Oh, it's been incredible. I'm surrounded by such amazing creative colleagues who have not just what I think most people traditionally think of as design backgrounds, right? They're not necessarily visual designers. IDEO thinks of design very broadly as a process that can apply to business and to organizations. And so we have business designers and organization designers and interaction designers. There's so many different disciplines. So it's incredibly inspiring to be around people who have very different skill sets and backgrounds and force me to think about things differently. I never imagined that I would work at IDEO because I hadn't thought of myself as a designer. But what appealed to me about joining IDEO when I was kind of looking out in 2015 and saying, I want to have an impact in this industry, where should I go? And it was amazing to me that IDEO had the foresight in 2015 to be starting this research group looking at how design could impact the evolution of blockchain technology and other emerging technologies, but at the time, primarily blockchain technology. And that foresight was incredible. And I think that one of the big things that we're still in need of in this industry is more application of design thinking and more putting users at the center of product development so that we can bridge the gap and get this over the chasm and really reach the potential to reach mainstream users.
So you work in a place that's called IDEO CoLab Ventures. What is the venture part? Are you actually investing in ventures, or are you exploring more partnering with them?
We're actually investing in ventures. So IDEO CoLab was started about 5.5 years ago, and it was a collaborative R&D lab. So we kind of were very similar and took a lot of inspiration from the MIT Media Lab in terms of having corporate members who we partnered with. But I think the big difference for the first few years was we really built hand in hand with the corporate members and with a lot of kind of academic partners that we worked with as well. So it was a real, very collaborative, hands-on process. But through that, we were getting very close to a lot of these early stage startups that were really on the bleeding edge of this new technology. And we realized that we could do a lot more and we could scale a lot better if we were able to inject capital into the ones that we had the strongest conviction around. And so a few of us on the team kind of on the side said, okay, well, let's pool some of our own money together and start making a few of these investments. And then we were very fortunate to find, a family office that also, agreed with our approach and co-invested with us. And we then went to the IDEO leadership and said, hey, what do you think about us starting a venture fund? And by the way, we've already got a little bit of a track record. And they were very receptive. And so we ended up creating IDEO CoLab Ventures, and we launched our first fund a couple years ago, now almost 2 years ago, and started investing in early stage companies in this space. We termed it broadly distributed web startups. And so that encompasses what we've talked about as decentralized finance. It touches on anything blockchain or crypto related. And we've made a couple dozen investments to date, mostly at the pre-seed and seed stage. And while I think the majority of them have had a very strong either DeFi or kind of FinTech component to them, there are some other things that are more around the future of work and gaming related things or pure infrastructure things that we're also very excited about.
Can you give me a couple of examples, not necessarily and not uniquely the companies that you've invested in, but if you look at the broad space, everything that you see in DeFi, what are some of the notable emerging startups, perhaps not just the famous ones that a lot of the insiders would have heard of, but some emerging ones that you are particularly intrigued by, maybe not necessarily because you feel like they're investable at the moment, but they're interesting and emerging because they are, chanting the chant of completely different business models or are exploring things that are really going to be key to the future.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to come up with ones that we haven't invested in to not just talk my book, but one that I am very excited about that we did invest in is called Pool Together, and they're actually building on top of Compound, that protocol that we discussed earlier. And what they're doing is they've created a protocol for an incentivized prize-linked savings account. And so the idea here, and it's not a new one in the world, but I think the application of it in this space is really unique. The idea is that people can deposit essentially digital dollars into an account, and they are their own custodian for that account, so nobody else can kind of take that away from them. They've got it, and every day or every week, depending on which account they choose, there is a drawing and a prize is assigned to one of the depositors. And that prize is made up of the interest that's accrued across all of the deposits. And so as a user, you can take out your initial deposit at any time, right? And so that's where the kind of no loss element comes in here. But the interest is then randomly distributed to one of the depositors, relative to the odds of winning or relative to the amount of deposits you have. So it enables a different type of gamblers to get into the gambling market or something? Yeah, well, so interestingly, this type of offering has existed for a long time. There's premium bonds in the UK. I've actually been following this concept for over a decade now. In the state of Michigan, a bunch of credit unions over a decade ago ran a pilot program called Save to Win. And they had I'm not sure I'm going to get the exact right numbers right now, but they had somewhere over 20,000 households participate, and they had to lock up their funds for a year, essentially, in these accounts for relatively small prizes. And what they found was that those who participated in this pilot program, that roughly 50% of them had not previously had a regular savings habit, and that 60% of them had played the lottery in the previous 6 months. So What they found was that this was actually a very effective psychological tool to redirect gambling behavior into savings behavior. And so I think that this insight of the ability to marry understanding of human psychology with some of these new financial tools, we can create tools, and Pool Together is creating tools that are promoting financial health by better understanding of human psychology to incentivize them to do behaviors that are ultimately good for them.
Well, now we're getting on to some interesting areas, and I'll give you a few more seconds to reflect on, possibly other startups, because it brings me to a thing that you had revealed to me, that you actually got a background as a gamer. So you're really interested in these games. You played at the Gathering. Tell us
Magic
about
the
what
Gathering,
it is.
yeah.
Magic the Gathering. Tell us about what's so fascinating about these games and gaming. I mean, it's a massive field, but it's more serious than a game is very serious, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Well, I think games are wonderful. I mean, fun is important. I think I learned a lot about strategy playing games, not just in my youth, but throughout my adulthood as well. And I do think that the idea of looking at game mechanics and understanding how you can incentivize or reinforce certain behaviors, how systems react based on individual actions and decisions are very important. And I think that that served me well. And some of the other people that I see doing very, very smart stuff in crypto, in decentralized finance, are often referencing various types of game mechanics in their designs, because we know that those are useful mechanics for engaging people and getting them to take certain actions.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask you now, because some of these things are really hard to fathom, frankly. I mean, it's a sector that's moving fast. It's slightly technical still, even though I agree with you, it has moved more into fields that are easier to understand. The platforms are becoming, more user-friendly. How do you explore this field in a fruitful way if you start from, I don't know, scratch, but you start from you start fresh, and how do you stay current?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is really hard to kind of get into. What I will say is the best way to do it is to try using it. And now I'm going to mention a couple companies that I'm not invested in, but I just think very highly of them. One is called Argent, Argent, and another is Dharma, Dharma. And they both have what I would call DeFi wallets. And so these are kind of user-controlled wallets, but they have an amazing experience where I think it's pretty friendly to people who are new to the space, and it gives them access to some of these DeFi tools and services in a way that's pretty magical. And I think trying those out for yourself and seeing how they work, hopefully it will be enough to get people intrigued and want to go and learn more. I think if they do want to dive in deeper, there's some good industry news sites and newsletters and publications that I recommend. I think Camilla Russo with The Defiant does a great job. Laura Shin, who writes for Forbes, has a couple of podcasts, Unconfirmed and Unchained, that are excellent. There's another publication, Bankless, if you're looking for more kind of the how do I actually put some of this stuff into practice. Bankless is fantastic. I think once you start reading a few of these things, hopefully it will trigger something and say, I want to go deeper. I want to learn more. But I think there's still those two wallets are a great place to start for using it and experiencing what the benefits can be.
And would you say that you spend, like, how much time do you spend just tracking the field versus kind of, like you said, acting in it, which is also important? Would you, like, what kind of time does it take for, let's say, a venture investor wants to switch some allocation of their portfolio into decentralized finance, or, whatever term they use, blockchain investments. Let's say I want to allocate 20%. Do I then, is it a complicated field compared to other fields you are tracking?
Well, I'm entirely focused on, this kind of distributed web technology, and almost entirely on decentralized finance. And I think I spend, all my time when I'm not with my family thinking about this and focused on it. And it's hard for me to keep up. There's just so much happening right now. So I think, if you're going to be an investor who's trying to pick and choose individual investments, in this space, I think you really have to spend some time going deep and really be focused full time on it. It's hard to do as one of the sectors that you're covering among others. I think that for people who are not full time investors but are looking to get some exposure to the space, there are a number of funds that you can go into that do have people who are focused full time on it, and I think that there are some things like Bitcoin and the currency for Ethereum, Ether or ETH. I think those things are, not to give financial advice, but those things are, in my view, they've been largely correlated with the growth of the possibilities on these networks. And so I encourage people who are looking to get involved in the space in some way to first look at kind of those base layer things to understand them, because they're the building blocks. And if you don't understand those building blocks, it's going to be really hard to get deeper into some of the more idiosyncratic pieces.
That's great. That's great advice. A lot of my listeners are corporate innovators. They work in large corporations. So what are some of the best case studies on how large corporations are starting to embrace these trends?
That's a great question. So I think that we've worked with some companies, including Citibank through their Citi Ventures arm, and Nasdaq and Fidelity have really been leaders in the space. If you're thinking about it from the financial services perspective, Fidelity has been an absolute leader. They launched their Fidelity Digital Assets subsidiary was it a year or two ago, and they've really, I think, understood more deeply than pretty much any large corporate out there the potential for this technology for quite a long time. I think if you're looking for examples outside of finance, there have been some examples. I think Walmart and Maersk have done some supply chain related things that have some interesting components to them, and those are some of the big areas that I would point to for kind of examples of what people have done.
Got it. Well, I'm going to leave it a little open for you now. I mean, we've talked about a lot of issues and concepts, and I feel like we have been through kind of a little guideline to what's happening in the field, at least superficially. What are some of the remaining issues that you are excited about going forward that we may not have covered so far?
So, I think that the areas that I would encourage people to think about is, what are the opportunities that have been limited by ability to access financial networks, and to think about what are the things where if you are an 18-year-old software developer sitting in India that were previously unthinkable that you can touch, those areas are now being opened up. We've worked with some folks, and literally when I say 18-year-old in India, we invested in a couple of brothers who were 19 and 21 out of Bangalore, who built a financial protocol that actually gives you access to all these other ones that has over $50 million sitting in it today. And I think that the amount of innovation that is possible now is just mind-blowing, and it's starting to accelerate the pace of development so much that it's worth trying something out yourself and just exploring the possibilities of saying, like, well, what if I really can just build any financial tool imaginable? Like, what would I build? Because it really is now open to anyone.
That's fascinating. Maybe lastly then, a lot of these things, you said 18-year-olds, but a lot of these developments could potentially also change finance for younger. Now, for younger people that are trying to get into this, even in the K through 12 system, what are some of the places they can go to in a very accessible way and understand what's going on. I'm saying this because, I'm the parent of kids that are really excitable, when it comes to new things, new technologies. They are exploring a lot of things. Kids are really interested in a lot of different areas. And what are some of the choices they have to kind of pick up on this early so that they arrive at, the MITs and, community colleges and wherever they end up, all of these youngsters of today, and are prepared for this world with so much opportunity to innovate, so much opportunity to learn, and also so many ways, as we have explored, to be financial actors, not just earlier than before, but much more independently than before.
Yeah, well, I'll say as a parent, but of children who are not yet teenagers, I almost hesitate to recommend specific online forums to go to because it can be difficult to know what's going to be there and what's going to be child appropriate. I don't know of any good resources that are specifically tailored for young adults, and I think maybe that's a good opportunity space for somebody to build some tools for that. I do have a family friend who, when he was having his bar mitzvah, we gifted him a small amount of Bitcoin. I think it was like $50 a Bitcoin or something like that a few years back. And for him, that he then had to figure out, okay, well, what do I do with this? Like, how do I even store this? And he got so interested and started learning and sending me questions about it and doing research on his own. I think in some ways, just giving kids some small amount of something to play around with, almost like an allowance, is a great way just to inspire their curiosity. Because look, the learning capacity of kids today is just, I think, so beyond what you and I probably experienced. When we were their age, they just have access to the internet and to tools and ways of interacting with their peers that were just unimaginable for us. And so I have a lot of faith in young people that if they are given a small chance and a small exposure to this space, that they're just going to understand it so much faster, right? I mean, I had to see Bitcoin at least 2 or 3 times before, it registered for me that there might be something worthwhile there. And I think a lot of people are the same way. So I think, youth today are going to grasp this, and in some ways, them coming into being more meaningful economic actors in the world is what's going to help push this technology to its next stage of growth, because they're just going to intuitively grasp it. For young people, the idea that, wait, it's after 5 p.m. I can't send money. What is that? Wait, markets are closed. It's daytime somewhere in the world. Why are these not global markets open 24/7? Why can't I access funds that I own because of some arbitrary restrictions on the numbers in the clock? So I think Gen Z or the Zoomers, whoever, they inherently grasp the opportunity here much more than people like you and me.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. I just, because the timelines here, are decades, I just wanted to bring it to that because, it is in some ways the children of today that will mature with this technology. So it's really important that they, I think, grasp it as early as possible. Thanks for all your advice, Dan. It's been wonderful to reconnect with you. And I truly hope that we can do this again. And until then, thanks so much. And thanks for educating me and hopefully my listeners.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion.
You have just listened to episode 5 of the Futurized podcast with host Trond Arne Undheim, futurist and author. The topic was the future of decentralized finance. Our guest was Dan Elitzer, investor at IDEO CoLab Ventures. My takeaway is that the promise of open finance is a world where everyone can freely create or deploy new financial instruments and business models without or with less of the intermediary constraints that traditional institutions have put on the system. Even if that will take decades, this is cause for optimism. It may also speed up innovation, but it may perhaps not disrupt banks to the point that they disappear, which indicates that it stands a chance to strike a balance between change and continuity.